Before we dive into the collision of two indigenous empires, I need you to do one thing: lean in, because this isn't the version of history you learned in school. If you care about real, untold stories that challenge the myth and reveal the power behind the past, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment with Empire so I know you're here for the truth. And stay with me until the end, because what happened between the Comanche and Apache will completely change how you see the American Southwest forever. Before there was a border, before Texas had a name, before anyone in Washington or Mexico City drew a line across a map and called it ownership, there were already two rising powers shaping the fate of the Southwest. And if you really want to understand the day the Comanche and Apache collided, you can't start with a battle. You have to start with the land. Because out here, the land doesn't just shape survival, it shapes identity, it shapes strategy, it shapes empires. The Apache came from the north, long before Spanish armor flashed under desert sun. Their roots trace back to Athabascan-speaking peoples who migrated down through what is now Western Canada and the American Southwest centuries before Europeans ever imagined this continent. That journey wasn't some straight-line march. It was adaptation in motion. By the time Apache groups settled across Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, and northern Mexico, they had already mastered something most outsiders never understood: how to live where others couldn't. Harsh desert, jagged mountains, dry riverbeds, brutal heat, freezing nights. That wasn't an obstacle, that was home. Apache society wasn't centralized like a European kingdom. There was no single capital, no crown. Power lived within bands, extended families, leaders who earned respect through courage, wisdom, and survival. And in that world, mobility meant life. They knew every canyon, every hidden spring, every mountain pass. If you moved through Apache territory without permission, chances are they saw you long before you saw them. And if they chose to strike, it would be fast, silent, and gone before you could process what just happened. Their warfare was shaped by terrain, guerrilla tactics, ambush. Hit hard, disappear, survive. But while the Apache were mastering desert and mountain, another transformation was happening further north on the plains. The people who would become the Comanche began as part of the Shoshonean-speaking groups of the Great Basin. And then something changed everything: the horse. When Spanish horses escaped or were traded north in the 1600s, they didn't just spread, they revolutionized. And no one adapted faster or more completely than the Comanche. Within a few generations, they became something the world had never seen before in North America. A mounted power that controlled open plains with speed and dominance that rivaled any cavalry force on Earth. If the Apache were masters of invisibility in harsh terrain, the Comanche became masters of movement across open country. They could ride before they could fully walk. Children learned to shoot from horseback as naturally as breathing. Their entire economy shifted around horse culture. Raiding, trading, hunting buffalo, projecting power across vast distances. The plains weren't empty space to them. They were highways, and with horses came expansion. By the early 1700s, Comanche groups began pushing south out of present-day Wyoming into the southern plains, into what is now Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. That push wasn't random, it was strategic. The southern plains offered enormous buffalo herds and access to trade routes that connected Spanish settlements in New Mexico and Mexico itself. With mobility on their side, the Comanche started reshaping the balance of power across the region. Now here's where tension starts to build. Before the Comanche expansion, many Apache groups had already occupied large portions of the southern plains. They hunted there, moved through there, defended there. But the Apache, while skilled horse users themselves, had not built their entire society around mounted open-field warfare the way the Comanche had. And when Comanche war parties began sweeping south in fast-moving raids, it wasn't just a clash of two groups. It was a clash of two military systems. Imagine it. Apache bands who had long controlled routes across the plains, now facing opponents who could outpace them in open terrain. Comanche riders who could circle, harass, and overwhelm in wide spaces where mountain cover didn't exist. The land itself began to tilt in favor of the newcomers. But this wasn't a simple story of one replacing the other. The Apache didn't just vanish, they adapted. Many retreated deeper into mountains and desert strongholds, reinforcing what they already did best. Others negotiated, shifted alliances, restructured movement patterns. Survival wasn't about pride, it was about continuity. Meanwhile, Spanish colonial authorities watched all of this unfold with a mix of fear and strategy. They tried to play both sides at different times, sometimes negotiating peace with the Apache to create buffer zones, sometimes arming or trading with the Comanche. European colonizers often described both nations as threats, but behind the scenes, they understood something critical. These were not scattered bands. These were organized, intelligent powers that could destabilize entire provinces. By the mid-1700s, the southern plains and southwest weren't just frontier zones. They were contested indigenous territory between two expanding forces. The Apache had legacy, deep knowledge of the terrain, cultural memory rooted in survival. The Comanche had explosive momentum, mobility, shock power, a rapidly growing sphere of influence that historians would later describe as an indigenous empire stretching across the heart of the continent. So when we talk about the day the Comanche and Apache collided, we're not talking about random hostility. We're talking about inevitability. Two adaptive powers expanding into overlapping space. Two warrior cultures forged by different geographies. Two identities built on autonomy and strength. And here's the thing most textbooks won't tell you. This wasn't some side conflict in the shadow of European colonization. This was a defining struggle that reshaped the balance of power across what would become the American Southwest. Entire migration patterns shifted because of it. Trade routes changed. Alliances formed and collapsed. By the time American expansion began pushing west in full force during the 1800s, the map had already been redrawn by indigenous hands. So before arrows flew and horses thundered across contested ground, before scouts spotted dust rising on the horizon, the real collision had already begun. It began with land, with adaptation, with ambition, and next, we're going to look at something even more intense, how these two nations actually fought. Because when masters of mountain warfare meet masters of mounted plains combat, the outcome isn't simple, it's strategic, it's brutal, and it changes everything. If you really want to understand what happened when the Comanche and Apache collided, you have to get inside their war minds. Not the Hollywood version, not the cowboy movie myth. I'm talking about real tactics, real strategy, real battlefield psychology. Because these weren't random skirmishes between small bands. These were confrontations between two of the most sophisticated indigenous military cultures in North America. Let's start with the Apache. Apache warfare wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about dramatic open field charges. It was about control, about patience, about knowing exactly when and where to strike. If you were moving through Apache territory in the mountains of Arizona or the desert edges of northern Mexico, you were already at a disadvantage. They knew the high ground. They knew the hidden water sources. They knew how long you could survive without shade, and most importantly, they knew how to disappear. Apache war parties were small, mobile, disciplined. They didn't need massive numbers, they needed surprise. A typical ambush would be planned with near surgical precision. Scouts would track movement for days. They would watch from ridge lines, reading body language, timing patterns, understanding when an enemy was relaxed. And then when the moment came, the strike was fast and devastating. Arrows first, gunfire if available, then immediate withdrawal before the enemy could reorganize. That wasn't cowardice, that was efficiency. In harsh terrain, prolonged engagement meant risk. The Apache didn't fight for drama, they fought to win and survive. Now shift north and east into the open plains, where the Comanche built something entirely different. The Comanche didn't just use horses, they fused with them. By the 1700s, Comanche riders were arguably the most skilled light cavalry force on the continent. Spanish officials described them with a mix of awe and fear. They could ride at full speed while hanging off the side of their horses, using the animal's body as a shield. They could loose arrows with precision at a gallop. They could turn, regroup, and strike again before an opponent even stabilized formation. Comanche warfare relied on speed and intimidation. Large mounted war parties could travel hundreds of miles in short time frames. That meant strategic surprise on a scale Apache mountain bands didn't typically attempt. The plains allowed visibility, but they also allowed momentum. If Apache fighters were masters of vertical terrain, the Comanche were masters of horizontal space. So now imagine this: an Apache band, skilled in ambush tactics, tracking a Comanche raiding party across semi-open terrain. The Apache know they can't allow prolonged open engagement. The Comanche know they must avoid being drawn into tight canyon traps. Both sides understand the other's strengths. This isn't chaos, this is chess. There are documented accounts from Spanish and later Mexican sources describing Apache groups being pushed out of certain plains regions by Comanche expansion. And it wasn't just because of numbers, it was because mounted warfare shifted the balance of power. In open country, the Comanche could surround, harass, and fragment opponents. But here's where it gets interesting. The Apache weren't static, they learned. They incorporated horses into their own warfare. They adjusted movement patterns. Some Apache groups began operating more fluidly between desert and plains zones. They didn't match Comanche cavalry dominance outright, but they adapted enough to remain formidable. And culturally, war meant something profound to both nations. For the Apache, raiding and warfare were often tied to survival and spiritual balance. Success in war brought prestige, but it also came with ritual responsibility. Warfare wasn't random aggression. It was embedded within a worldview shaped by land and ancestors. For the Comanche, power projection across territory reinforced dominance. Raids weren't just about immediate gain. They were about maintaining influence across trade networks, stretching into Spanish settlements and deep into Mexico. The Comanche became so dominant in certain periods that historians now describe their sphere of influence as the Comanche Empire. That's not exaggeration, that's geopolitical reality. And when two systems like this meet, it's never a single decisive battle. It's a series of pressures, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, quick retaliations, strategic withdrawals. Picture a scenario. Comanche riders sweep south toward traditional Apache hunting grounds. They strike a settlement or intercept a trading route. Apache scouts observe from distance. They don't rush into open pursuit. They wait until the Comanche war party begins returning north, possibly heavier, with captured horses or goods. Then, in terrain that begins to narrow, the Apache strike from elevation. The Comanche respond by breaking formation, spreading wide, refusing to be boxed in. They use speed to scatter rather than hold ground. It's dynamic, it's fluid, and it's shaped entirely by geography. What makes this collision so powerful historically is that neither side was primitive. Neither side was disorganized. Both had generational knowledge of warfare passed down through oral tradition, training, and lived experience. Young boys grew up watching veterans recount tactics, not just heroics. They learned reading wind direction, understanding tracks, judging distance and speed. And here's the part that most modern audiences miss. This wasn't just conflict between two groups. This struggle redefined territory across what would become Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Entire Apache bands were gradually pushed further into mountainous and desert zones because open plains became too dangerous under Comanche dominance. That shift changed trade, migration, and survival patterns long before American forces arrived in full scale. So when we talk about the day two indigenous empires collided, it's not a single cinematic clash frozen in time. It's the moment when two highly evolved military cultures realized they were operating in the same expanding space, and neither intended to surrender it. Next, we move into the territory itself, because war isn't abstract, it's tied to land. And the southern plains and borderlands would become the stage where tension finally ignited into something even bigger. Now, we step into the land where everything tightened. Because wars don't just explode out of nowhere. They build pressure. And by the mid-1700s, the southern plains and the northern frontier of New Spain weren't just territories, they were fault lines. Picture the map in your head, what we now call Texas, Oklahoma, eastern New Mexico, northern Mexico. Wide plains rolling into broken hills, river systems cutting through tall grass, buffalo moving in massive herds like dark waves across the horizon. This wasn't empty land, it was economic lifeblood. Whoever controlled these routes controlled horses, trade, food, and influence. For generations, various Apache groups had operated across large portions of this region. They weren't static settlers in the European sense. They moved seasonally, strategically, following resources and security patterns. Their knowledge of the terrain ran deep. But when the Comanche fully transitioned into mounted powerhouses, something changed. The horse didn't just make the Comanche mobile, it made them scalable. Suddenly, distances that once required weeks on foot could be covered in days. Raiding became long-range, trade became expansive. Comanche war parties could strike Spanish settlements in New Mexico, move through Texas, and push deep into northern Mexico before anyone could organize a response. And as their numbers grew and their horse herds multiplied, so did their influence. Historians later referred to this region as Comancheria, a vast zone of Comanche dominance stretching across the southern plains. That dominance didn't happen overnight. It was built through calculated pressure, and here's where the Apache felt the squeeze. Open plains that had once been part of Apache's seasonal movement became increasingly dangerous. Comanche riders could see for miles. Their ability to coordinate large mounted formations meant they could overwhelm smaller Apache bands caught in exposed terrain. It wasn't that the Apache suddenly lost their skill, it was that the battlefield itself was changing. Now, add another layer. Spanish colonial authorities in New Mexico and Texas were watching this unfold in real time. To them, both the Apache and Comanche were threats. But they quickly realized something. They couldn't defeat either group outright. So they did what empires often do. They played balance of power politics. At different times, Spanish officials negotiated peace with Apache groups to create buffer zones against Comanche expansion. In other moments, they attempted diplomacy with Comanche leaders to reduce raids on settlements. Guns, trade goods, livestock, all of it flowed through fragile agreements that could collapse overnight. This wasn't just indigenous warfare. It was a three-dimensional power struggle involving native empires and European colonies. As Comanche influence expanded southward into Texas and northern Mexico, they began to dominate key trade routes. Horses became currency, captives were integrated or traded, economic networks stretched hundreds of miles. The Comanche weren't simply raiders, they were strategic economic actors. Meanwhile, Apache groups began consolidating deeper into mountain and desert strongholds, regions where Comanche cavalry advantage diminished. The Sierra Madre, the rugged canyons of Arizona and New Mexico, these became fortified homelands. But that retreat wasn't passive, it was tactical recalibration. The tension escalated along transitional zones, the edges where plains met broken terrain. These borderlands became friction points, Apache scouts tracking Comanche movements, Comanche riders testing deeper southern incursions, skirmishes, retaliatory raids, stolen horse herds, each act fueling the next. And understand this clearly, these weren't symbolic gestures. Horses were wealth. Losing a herd wasn't embarrassment, it was economic damage. Capturing horses wasn't random theft, it was strategic advantage. By the late 1700s, Comanche power across the southern plains had grown so significant that Spanish officials in Mexico City were forced to recognize it in diplomatic negotiations. Think about that. An indigenous power compelling a European colonial government to negotiate on near equal footing. That's the scale we're talking about. But even as Comanche dominance solidified across open plains, they never fully neutralized Apache resistance. The Apache shifted warfare patterns. Smaller, more evasive bands. Strategic relocation, avoiding prolonged exposure in open country. They remained dangerous in terrain that neutralized mounted superiority, so the land itself became layered. Plains increasingly under Comanche influence, mountains and deserts reinforcing Apache resilience. But the zones in between, those were volatile. Imagine being a young warrior in either nation during this time. You're not fighting strangers from across an ocean. You're fighting people who understand the land almost as deeply as you do. You can't underestimate them. You can't rely on simple intimidation. Every movement requires calculation. And here's the tragic irony. While these two indigenous powers reshaped the Southwest through strategic competition, a larger force was slowly building beyond the horizon. American expansion wasn't yet at full pressure, but it was coming. The Louisiana Purchase, westward migration, military forts, railroads. All of that would eventually disrupt the balance entirely. But in this moment, before full US expansion, the Southwest belonged to indigenous geopolitics. The collision wasn't a single battle. It was territorial chess played across decades. But there were moments when the pressure crystallized, when scouts saw dust rising in contested zones, when retreat wasn't possible, when both sides had to engage. And that's where we're heading next, because eventually, tension doesn't stay theoretical. It turns into confrontation, not rumor, not maneuvering, direct clash. The day they met in open war wasn't about mythology. It was about power, survival, and the brutal reality of two indigenous empires testing each other in real time. By the time it finally happened, the kind of confrontation people would later whisper about, it wasn't some random eruption of chaos. It was the release of years of tension, raids answered by counter-raids, horse herds taken and reclaimed. Hunting grounds crossed one too many times, and somewhere along the shifting edge, where plains dissolved into broken terrain, two war parties realized they were no longer just maneuvering around each other, they were face to face. Now understand something. There isn't a single Hollywood-style Battle of G stamped neatly into European records, because much of this conflict lived in indigenous memory and scattered colonial reports. But Spanish and later Mexican sources do describe major engagements between Comanche and Apache groups in the 1700s, especially across Texas and northern Mexico. And when we reconstruct what those clashes likely looked like, based on military patterns, terrain, and documented tactics, the picture is intense. Imagine early morning on the southern plains, light just starting to break across tall grass. A Comanche war party moving south, dozens of riders, maybe more. Their horses lean and conditioned, their scouts fanned wide. They're not careless. They know Apache bands operate in these transitional zones. But open terrain gives them confidence. Now shift perspective. Apache scouts positioned along slightly elevated ground, where prairie begins to fracture into rougher landscape. They've been tracking this group for days, counting numbers, watching spacing, observing whether captives or stolen horses are in tow. They know engaging in pure open ground is risky, but they also know the Comanche can't resist pushing deeper if they think resistance is minimal. The Apache don't rush. That's not their way. They let the Comanche move into terrain that begins to narrow. Subtle shifts, low ridges, dry creek beds, broken visibility. Then it happens. An arrow from elevation. Maybe gunfire if firearms are available through trade. Horses rear. Riders scatter instinctively. The Comanche don't freeze. That's critical. They react with speed. Formation breaks wide, not inward. Riders spread to avoid concentrated fire. Some circle immediately to identify flanking threats. What you're watching isn't chaos. It's two military systems activating at full capacity. Apache fighters use terrain to fragment the mounted advantage. They don't stand in clusters. They strike, reposition, strike again. The goal isn't dramatic dominance, it's disruption, slow the horses, break momentum. But the Comanche are masters of rapid adaptation. If the terrain allows even partial mobility, they exploit it. Riders sweep wide arcs to flush out hidden positions. Mounted archers fire while in motion, forcing Apache fighters to relocate or risk being overrun. The thunder of hooves isn't just sound, it's psychological pressure. Dust rises, visibility drops, communication relies on signals, shouts, intuition. And here's where the real difference shows. The Comanche thrive in fluid motion. They're built for extended mounted engagement. If the Apache can't pull them into tight, restrictive terrain quickly enough, the battle tilts. Comanche riders can feint retreat, draw fighters into slightly more open ground, then wheel back with coordinated speed. But if the Apache succeed in fragmenting the fight into smaller pockets near rocky cover, the balance shifts again. In tighter terrain, horses lose maneuvering space. Ambush tactics regain power. These clashes were rarely clean victories. More often they were brutal, fast, and costly for both sides. Casualties mattered deeply in societies where every skilled warrior represented generational knowledge and strength. There are accounts suggesting that over time, sustained Comanche pressure across the open plains forced many Apache groups to abandon certain territories altogether, not because they were weak, but because strategically, maintaining presence in open plains against superior cavalry was inefficient. That shift itself is evidence of how intense these confrontations were. Now zoom out for a second. When historians later refer to the rise of Comanche dominance across the southern plains in the 18th century, they're not romanticizing. They're describing a geopolitical transformation driven in part by victories in these very kinds of clashes. The Apache didn't disappear. They recalibrated. They consolidated deeper into mountain strongholds, where they would later become nearly impossible for Spanish, Mexican, and eventually American forces to subdue. But on this day, this symbolic collision, what stands out isn't just who gained or lost ground. It's the realization that neither side was myth, neither was primitive. This was advanced tactical warfare shaped entirely by indigenous innovation. Imagine the aftermath. Horses wounded or captured, warriors tending to injuries with practiced efficiency, silent evaluation of losses, strategic reassessment. Because war in this world wasn't about total annihilation, it was about leverage. Comanche leaders would evaluate whether deeper southern expansion remained sustainable. Apache leaders would assess whether retaliation was necessary or whether strategic withdrawal preserved long-term strength. And all of this unfolded without European command structures directing it. This was indigenous statecraft in motion. But here's the haunting layer. While Comanche and Apache forces were refining tactics against each other, colonial powers were studying them, learning weaknesses, mapping terrain, negotiating treaties selectively. Both nations were powerful, but prolonged conflict between them also meant exhaustion over time. The day they collided wasn't the end of anything. It was a chapter in a long struggle for territorial dominance that reshaped the Southwest. And next, we're going to explore what happened after the dust settled, because the consequences of these collisions didn't just shift boundaries between two nations. They opened the door for something much larger to move in. When the dust settled after those clashes, there wasn't a clear line drawn in the soil saying, "This side wins." That's not how indigenous geopolitics worked in the 1700s. What happened instead was quieter, but far more powerful. Territory shifted, migration routes changed, power consolidated, and the map of the Southwest, long before it was ever American, was redrawn by indigenous hands. By the late 18th century, the Comanche had secured dominant control over vast portions of the southern plains. What scholars now call Comancheria wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was a real sphere of influence stretching across present-day Texas, Oklahoma, eastern New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Kansas. Buffalo-rich lands, trade arteries, raiding corridors reaching deep into northern Mexico. That dominance wasn't based on a single battle. It was built through sustained pressure, mounted superiority in open terrain, strategic intimidation, economic leverage through horse trade and captive exchange. Spanish colonial officials didn't treat the Comanche as scattered raiders anymore. They negotiated with them as a regional power. And the Apache? They didn't collapse. They adapted. Many Apache groups withdrew further into mountain and desert zones where cavalry advantage diminished. The rugged landscapes of Arizona, New Mexico, and the Sierra Madre became not just refuges, but fortified cultural centers. In those environments, Apache guerrilla tactics regained full potency. Spanish, Mexican, and later American forces would learn the hard way that Apache mountain warfare was nearly impossible to extinguish. But here's the key shift. The long contest between Comanche and Apache had altered their strategic positions just as a new era was approaching. Think about the timing. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, Spanish colonial authority weakened. Mexico gained independence in 1821. Political instability rippled across the northern frontier. And in that instability, Comanche power actually expanded even further south. Massive raids into Mexican territory became more frequent and more devastating. Entire settlements were abandoned under sustained pressure. Meanwhile, Apache groups operating from desert and mountain strongholds continued raiding and resisting in their own spheres. They maintained autonomy, but the open plains were no longer theirs in the same way they had been before Comanche expansion. Now, zoom out again. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase reshaped American ambitions. By the 1830s and 1840s, U.S. expansionist momentum accelerated. Texas independence, the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Suddenly, American military infrastructure began pressing deeper into lands that had long been shaped by Comanche and Apache rivalry. And here's the tragic irony. For decades, these two indigenous powers had competed for control of territory. They had tested each other, displaced each other, reshaped the region through indigenous conflict. But now, a new power entered the stage with industrial logistics, standing armies, railroads, and a doctrine of manifest destiny. The Comanche, who had forced Spain and Mexico into negotiation, now faced the United States. The Apache, who had retreated strategically into harsh terrain to preserve autonomy, now confronted a military machine determined to break resistance through fort systems and relentless pursuit. And the prior conflict between Comanche and Apache mattered here. Years of territorial struggle had already fragmented alliances and drained resources. There was no unified indigenous coalition waiting to confront American expansion. Each nation faced the coming storm largely on its own terms. By the mid-1800s, U.S. cavalry campaigns targeted Comanche strongholds across the plains. Buffalo herds, the backbone of Comanche economic power, were systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, Apache resistance would erupt in decades-long campaigns across Arizona and northern Mexico, culminating in figures like Geronimo, who became symbols of defiance. But remember this. Before American cavalry ever engaged either nation in full force, the Southwest had already been shaped by indigenous empire-level strategy. The open plains belonged to Comanche influence because of indigenous warfare, not European decree. The desert and mountains remained Apache strongholds because of adaptive resistance forged in conflict with both Comanche and colonizers. The aftermath of their collision wasn't extinction, it was transformation. Comanche dominance of the plains would eventually crumble under U.S. pressure, but their legacy as one of the most formidable mounted powers in North American history remains undeniable. Apache resistance, refined through both intertribal conflict and colonial warfare, would become one of the longest and most resilient campaigns against American expansion. And here's what really hits when you sit with it. The collision between Comanche and Apache wasn't meaningless bloodshed. It was indigenous geopolitics at a continental scale. It shaped who controlled land, who held trade routes, who influenced colonial negotiations. It defined the Southwest before the United States ever planted its permanent flag across it. By the time railroads cut through plains and forts dotted the frontier, the map had already been rewritten once. The collision of these two empires didn't end with a single decisive moment. It echoed forward. It set conditions. It influenced how each would face the storm of the 19th century. And next, we're going to confront something even deeper. The myths. The way Hollywood simplified this story. The way textbooks flattened it. Because if we don't correct that narrative, we miss the real magnitude of what happened when two indigenous empires collided. Because if you grew up in the United States, especially anywhere west of the Mississippi, chances are you were handed a version of this story that barely scratched the surface. Cowboys and Indians, good guys and bad guys, raids reduced to chaos, tribal conflict flattened into background noise before the real story of American expansion begins. But when you actually look at the collision between the Comanche and Apache through a historical lens, not a Hollywood one, what you see is something way more powerful. You see two indigenous empires operating with strategic depth, economic systems, diplomacy, military doctrine, and territorial vision. And that word matters. Empire. For a long time, historians avoided applying that term to native nations. But modern scholarship has forced a re-evaluation. The Comanche, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries, controlled trade networks stretching from the Arkansas River down into northern Mexico. They dictated terms to Spanish governors. They reshaped settlement patterns through sustained military pressure. That's not random raiding, that's geopolitical influence. The Apache, while organized differently, demonstrated something equally formidable: long-term resistance adaptability. Even after being pressured out of certain plains regions by Comanche expansion, they maintained control of desert and mountain zones that later proved nearly impossible for colonial and American forces to dominate. Their decentralized structure, once misunderstood as weakness, was actually strategic flexibility. When one band was pressured, others continued operating, but popular culture rarely shows that. Instead, we get simplified images, feathered warriors charging recklessly, tribal rivalries portrayed as primitive infighting. The nuance disappears, the strategy disappears, the political intelligence disappears. And here's what that distortion does. It makes indigenous history look reactionary, as if native nations only responded to Europeans. In reality, the Southwest before full American expansion was shaped primarily by indigenous power dynamics. The Comanche didn't become dominant because Spain allowed it. They became dominant because they mastered mounted warfare and leveraged it ruthlessly and intelligently. The Apache didn't survive centuries of pressure because they were lucky. They survived because their mobility, terrain mastery, and social organization made total conquest nearly impossible. The collision between them wasn't meaningless violence. It was the meeting of two adaptive systems competing in a limited ecological and political space. That's human history. That's statecraft. And here's the deeper truth. When American expansion accelerated in the 19th century, both nations were already seasoned by decades, even centuries, of warfare, negotiation, and territorial management. U.S. military officers who later fought Comanche and Apache forces often remarked on their tactical sophistication. This wasn't romantic admiration, it was battlefield respect. But by then, the scale of opposition had changed. Industrial weaponry, expanding population, systematic buffalo extermination, fort networks, railroads. The collision between Comanche and Apache had shaped the region. But the arrival of a global industrial power reshaped the rules entirely. Still, what came before matters. Because if we reduce indigenous conflict to side notes in American history, we miss something massive. We miss that North America was not an empty wilderness waiting for European order. It was a continent of political entities, alliances, rivalries, and strategic evolution. When the Comanche pushed south and displaced Apache groups from large portions of the plains, that was territorial reorganization on a continental scale. When Apache bands recalibrated into mountain strongholds and later waged decades-long resistance campaigns, that was strategic endurance. These weren't footnotes, they were defining forces. So when we say the day two indigenous empires collided, we're not just talking about a dramatic moment in the dust. We're talking about a turning point in the indigenous balance of power in the Southwest, a shift that shaped trade routes, migration paths, colonial negotiations, and eventually the way American expansion unfolded. And here's the thing that hits hardest. Neither nation vanished. Despite warfare, despite displacement, despite US. Campaigns, Comanche and Apache communities exist today. Their cultures, languages, and identities survived policies designed to erase them. That endurance might be the most powerful legacy of all. History got a lot wrong. It oversimplified, it romanticized, it minimized. But when you peel back those layers, what you see is clear. This wasn't a clash between tribes. It was a contest between sovereign powers operating within a complex indigenous world long before the United States defined itself. And maybe that's the real collision. Not just between Comanche and Apache, but between myth and reality. If you look at the Southwest today, the highways cutting across plains, the cities rising where buffalo once moved, the borders separating nations. Remember that long before all of that, two indigenous empires shaped this land through strategy, courage, and relentless adaptation, and their story deserves to be told.